We'll speak about the excavating textual layers of GA06 in Romance, and we look forward to your thing.
Thank you. From the earliest attempts to group manuscripts into families to the present, the concept of the Western text has played a significant role in the way that New Testament textual critics conceptualize the transmission history of the New Testament. Although the language of text types is now widely questioned and indeed could even be said to be abandoned, the broader concept of Eastern and Western clusters of witnesses continues to influence, sometimes under the surface, but continues to influence the way that many scholars understand the textual history of the Pauline Corpus. While readings claimed by someone at some point as Western can be found all over the tradition, it's widely agreed that the only extant Greek continuous text witnesses to the Western text, in quotes, the text of Romans, are the bilinguals 06, 012, and their various abstrictive. Yet though the earliest evidence for the Western text is found in 06, it's long been thought that this witness uniquely preserves a textual form that must be very early indeed, perhaps taking us back to a time of free copying that precedes our earliest extant evidence, demonstrating, and this has been used to make this case by several different scholars, demonstrating that the transmission of the Greek text is not nearly as cohesive as it might appear if we look at our monolingual witnesses. Before I get to the specific contribution and argument made by this paper, I need to briefly introduce two interlocutors that will be significant for what follows. The most substantial effort to reconstruct the textual history of the Pauline Corpus is that by Zuntz in his landmark work entitled The Text of the Epistles. For our purposes this afternoon, there are 2 points I need to briefly highlight. First, Zuntz divides the textual history of the epistles into 2 main branches, or he refers to them as streams, one Western and the other Eastern. The only extant Greek evidence for this Western branch are the bilinguals. However, Zuntz is confident that taken together with the Old Latin manuscripts and the citations of Tertullian, that this demonstrates the existence of a Western text in Greek. In the earliest period of transmission, itself the result, Zuntz argues, of the lax attitude towards textual accuracy that claims prevailed at this time. Second, Zuntz is confident that, quote, no special relation exists between P46 and the leading Western manuscript, which in context is 06. Because of this, and because P46 and 06 are both supposed by Zuntz to bring us back to the earliest period, he argues that, quote, P46 alone with one Western witness can be right against the whole of the other tradition. That's the first interlocutor. Second, 3 years ago, Peter Lorenz produced a groundbreaking work entitled A History of Codex Bezae's Text in the Gospel of Mark. At great, very great length, and in great, very great detail, he painstakingly disassembled a number of the standard assumptions about this so-called Western text. Now, there's certainly room to quibble on particular readings or points of detail. In my view, he conclusively demonstrates at least the following. Number one, while some individual readings in Bezae may be quite early, the overall form of the text, as we now have it, does not derive from careless or creative copying in the 2nd century, but rather from a complex process of layered diorthosis that is best dated to the middle or towards the end of the 4th century. Number two, diorthosis against Latin exemplars other than its own Latin column can account for a number of the distinctive Greek readings of Bezae. Many of these Latin readings, in turn, can be explained by translational processes and do not necessarily require a Greek homologa different from the standard Greek text. Number three, while the correction of Greek manuscripts against Latin manuscripts sounds counterintuitive to us and has sounded counterintuitive to many previous generations of Western, in this case, European and American scholars, Lorenz demonstrates that there were indeed actors, such as Ambrosiaster, in the 4th century, who are on record of thinking that their Latin manuscripts gave them better access to the Greek original than the Greek manuscripts to which they had access. Furthermore, there were bilingual scholars with the skills necessary to perform this sort of diorthosis that were present in Bezae's immediate production context. While Lorenz's work is exclusively focused on the text of Mark in 05, it nevertheless poses a significant challenge and raises some significant questions for the overall model of textual history that is proposed by Zuntz. This paper is an attempt to extend that challenge to the textual history of Romans by beginning to excavate the textual layers that are present in 06. I have three primary points that I want us to consider today. First, I'm going to briefly introduce the data set and methodology I use so you can know what this is all based on. Then to the two main points. Contrary to Zunes, I want to establish that at least in Romans, the text of 06 is schematically very close to P46 and to a lesser extent 03. Third, I want to show that at least some of the distinctive readings in 06 and the other bilinguals are much more likely to be the result of translational factors in Latin rather than transcriptional factors in Greek. These readings are created by translators, not by scribes. First, for the data. Primary data for this paper is taken from Hugh Houghton's preliminary collation of the 152 witnesses of Romans that were selected for the ECM. I should note that this selection of witnesses takes into account Alan Fisher's recent demonstration that 010 is indeed a copy of 012. Hugh provided me with a spreadsheet that listed every place where 06 differs from the base text, which is the NA28, and that's the base text of collation. While I'll reference the readings of 012 at a few points, the paper as a whole is focused on 06 because 06 is one of our early witnesses, and also because Alan is giving a paper on 012. Given the data set, unless otherwise noted, when I speak of the bilinguals, I'm referring specifically to the textual cluster 06, 012, and their various descriptive. So in this data set, I first set aside all merely orthographic variation, interchanges between equivalent sounds like omicron and omega, consonantal duplication and simplification, and exchanges between eopto and opto. Given my focus on variation units where the reading of 06 is securely non-original, I also set aside a few readings where 06 disagrees with the NA28 in agreement with the Tyndale-House New Testament because I was looking for places where 06's readings are securely non-original. These exclusions left 273 variation units where 06 securely differs from the initial text of Romans. Since a few of these units should arguably be taken together, this number is approximate rather than precise. For each of these readings, so that's my spreadsheet that I started with, I added in the full support of all the other witnesses in the collation and also the support of those witnesses for readings that could possibly be connected to the reading of 06, even if the reading wasn't the same. I separated out in separate columns the readings of the early bilinguals and also the later bilinguals, 6 through 9, that we'll come back to in a minute. I also distinguished readings that have other early reading support from readings that are found only in the later tradition. I next incorporated the data from my collation of Chrysostom's Homilies on Romans, and finally, I analyzed and incorporated the Latin evidence found in Hugh's collation of the Old Latin witnesses for Romans. So that's the data this is all based on. That brings us to our first primary point, the relationship between 06, P46, and 03. Even before the discovery of P46, some sort of connection between 06 and 03 has long been recognized for Paul. Hort, for example, considered such points of overlap to be Western corruptions in the otherwise pure neutral text. Zunes considers them, where not original, to be holdovers from the very earliest period. I think it's much more likely that, as Carlson suggested in his work on Galatians, he still uses this language of Eastern and Western, but he notices that there's a schematic connection between the bottom layers of the Greek text of the bilingual tradition and the text of Romans in 03, and especially in P46. Of course, the text of 03 is by a significant margin our closest representative to the initial text of Romans. It does not have many distinctive readings because the vast majority of its readings are original. Furthermore, P46 has many lacunae in Romans, further reducing opportunities for distinctive overlaps between all three of these witnesses. Nevertheless, there remain a few places where P46, 03, and the bilinguals share readings that are either unique or are found only in a small handful of later minuscules. Table 1 provides a list of those readings. But these readings are by no means the only evidence for a connection between these witnesses. There are 5 additional locations where 06 agrees with 03 in securely non-original readings, either uniquely or in conjunction with 012. You can see those in Table 2. Particularly striking is the highly unusual shared substitution of diorthosis, a word found nowhere else in the New Testament or LXX, for the common word diakonia. This is not the sort of reading that is likely to have been generated more than once. It's schematically significant. As a side note, since the focus of this paper is on the textual layers of 06, this first table is the only place where I considered potential additional points of contact with 012. You can see an additional example there. Much more significant are the no fewer than 19 unique agreements of P46 with 06, with or without the agreement of 012. Of course, 012 and 06 share a common ancestor. These are presented in Table 3. Some of these readings are quite distinctive and very unlikely to have occurred more than once in the tradition. Among the more notable are the substitution of apophyllomata for apophthomata in 1312, the unique addition of ket alone in 1602, and the unique addition of legantos in 1617. To put the significance of these 19 distinctive agreements into perspective, no other witness other than 03 and P46 uniquely agrees with 06 with or without 012, the bilingual tradition, more than twice. So we've got 19 unique agreements with P46, and the highest number for any other witness is 2, and those are much less significant readings. Furthermore, P46 has a lacuna in no fewer than 117 of the 273 locations in the dataset, meaning that its opportunity to have a unique agreement is like half that of most of the other witnesses. It reduces the opportunities for unique agreements. To look at this all from a different angle, 108 of the 273 non-original readings of 06 have no Greek support outside of the bilinguals. We'll get to those readings here in a moment. P46 is present for 101 of the 165 readings that remain, and it agrees with 06 in no fewer than 45 of these secondary readings. And there are 6 additional locations where there seems to be a connection between the reading of 06 and P46, even when those readings are not identical. So there are many more connections with P46 in readings that are not unique agreements. We'll see one more of those readings at the end of the paper. A number of these non-unique agreements between the bilinguals and P46 or 03 or 03 are distinctive secondary witnesses that are shared by a small handful of other witnesses. They're not just readings that are found in a lot of the tradition, so they're also significant. In conclusion, on this point at very least, Zunz's conclusions about the relationship of 06 and P46 do not apply to Romans. From the point of view of either traditional Lacanian schematics or phylogenetic schematics, the connection between P46 and the bilinguals is one of the strongest relationships in the entire textual tradition of Romans. So far from being completely separate, they are the most closely schematically related witnesses in the tradition of Romans as a whole. Now, I maybe want to qualify that because we haven't studied the whole tradition of Romans, but it's one of the strongest and most persistent, easily detected relationships in the tradition. Therefore, it is simply not tenable, at least for Romans, to take them as representatives of 2 widely separated streams. There is, if you look at Zunz's chart, there's a great gulf fixed between the Eastern and the Western traditions, and these 06 and P46 sort of stand at the beginning of each of these 2 streams. But that is not tenable. And according to him, they both go back to the earliest period of transmission. It makes much more sense to see a text somewhere between P46 and 03 as being the textual starting point, the base layer in the process of layered development that led to the text that we find in 06 for Romans. Now, of course, the text of 06, as we now have it in the text of the other bilinguals, is rather different than either P46 or 03. So we have these distinctive agreements that closely connect them, but we also have readings that separate them. Where do those come from? It contains a number of distinctive readings not found in either of these witnesses, and indeed a number of distinctive readings not found in any other Greek witness. This brings us to our final point. At least some of the distinctive readings in 06 and the other bilinguals are much more likely to be the result of translational processes in Latin than transcriptional processes in Greek. At least some of the distinctive readings in 06, and potentially many of the distinctive readings in 06, are more likely to be the result of translational practices in Latin rather than transcriptional processes in Greek. It's long been recognized that there are places where the Latin column of 06 has influenced the Greek column, as there are also places where the Greek column has influenced the Latin column. Vogels, for example, points this out in a number of places. But at the same time, the general assumption has also been that most, if not all, of the distinctive readings that are found in the Latin column of 06 and other Old Latin witnesses go back to lost Greek exemplars of the so-called Western text. This is a point that Zeus makes explicitly, and indeed, so that these Latin witnesses are supposed to be able to take us back to lost Greek witnesses that represent this freely and inventively copied Western text. But what I want to show is not simply that the Latin influenced the Greek, but that there are at least some places, and perhaps many, I want to find a few clear places where we can clearly see this happening, where the Latin is the source, that is the source of that influence, is perfectly explicable as a translation of the reading that's found in all Greek witnesses outside of Ephesus. To be clear, I'm not arguing for the influence of Latin on the scribe of 06, or even the scribe of the common ancestor of 06 and 012. I'm arguing that these readings are the result of a careful, albeit misguided, work of textual scholarship, in which a manuscript rather close to P46 and 03 was intentionally corrected against an old Latin text or texts, and that the readings in that old Latin text or text do not derive from a lost Greek witnesses that had that reading, but are the result of the process of translation itself. Rather than provide a long list of possible examples, I want to look more carefully and consider 3 of what I would consider to be clear examples of how this suggested process would have worked in practice. Example 1 is the addition of philoxomen in Romans 14:19. As Andy Patton conclusively demonstrates in a forthcoming article he kindly shared with me, thank you, Andy, the distinctive text of the 14th century manuscript 629 is the result of the precise sort of process that I'm proposing for a number of the distinctive readings in 06. So in this manuscript, a medieval scholar carefully corrected a standard Byzantine Greek text to correspond to a Latin text that is largely Vulgate, though with some distinctive readings of its own, and we'll hear about those from Andrea Martino later on in the colloquium. This is why this witness, 629, for example, is the earliest Greek witness to have the comma ioneum in 1 John 5:7. In other words, when this witness has non-Byzantine Greek readings, those readings can be consistently traced back to the influence of the Latin, as Patton's article is called, it is altered, not antique. Now, the Vulgate of the Pauline epistles is itself a revision of some form of the Old Latin, and it agrees with it in many places. So if the distinctive agreements of the early bilinguals with the Latin tradition are themselves the result of translation, followed by retroversion in the context of diorthosis, we should expect to find places, if this is what happened, we know this is what happened for 629, and if we're saying this is what also happened in 06, and if there's a lot of overlap between the Latin of the Vulgate and the Latin of the Old Latin, then we should expect some places where the same readings show up. And indeed, that is what we find. There are 11 places where 629 agrees with 06, with or without 12, in conforming to the Latin against the entire remainder of the Greek tradition. I'll give you one example for which the evidence is presented in Table 4. In Romans 14:19, the standard Greek text reads, Arun tatis ilinis, diokomen tatis, ikodomis, tis is allelus. As the ESV renders this, so then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. So in the Greek, we have this one action, pursuing, and then we have two objects of pursuit, the things that make for peace and the things that make for the building up of one another, or the things that make for edification. However, the majority of the Old Latin, as well as a number of Vulgate manuscripts, including the Latin column of 629, add custodiamus. So two objects and two verbs. Custodiamus, let us guard, after inveto. 06 and 012 added philoxomen, while 629 has added philoxomen. The unlikelihood of the producers of 629 having access to early Greek exemplars of the Latin tradition that have now been lost makes it highly probable that both of these are independent retroversions of a word that was added in the process of Latin translation. Now, the case preceding the addition of this word as a result of the translational process is strengthened by the fact that, as shown in the handout following the table, at least 3 different English translations have independently added an explicit verb at precisely this point. And I don't think the translator of the Message paraphrase had access to lost Greek witnesses. It is a known feature of translation to simplify the syntax by adding explicit verbs where the verbs are implied in the original. It makes the text easier to read. This is a translational, not a transcriptional feature. Translation is inherently more creative than transcription. If you've ever tried to translate a text, you know this. It takes thought and effort. You have to think through how to translate, whereas transcription is largely mechanical. and the changes that take place in translation and the changes that take place in transcription are distinct. The addition of this verb in this place is a fully explicable attempt at simplifying the syntax. We therefore have no reason to suspect this Western reading goes back to a lost Greek exemplar, and every reason to think that it was generated in the course of translation and only later found its way into the bilingual tradition. The first example. Second example, substitution of eroto for pericalo in 1617. Now, of course, 629 was corrected against some form of the Vulgate, so again, there's odd readings, rather than the Old Latin, and these processes of correction were entirely independent. And if these processes were independent, we would expect that while there will be some points of overlap, there will be more points of non-overlap, and indeed, that is what we find. Romans 16:17 provides an example of a reading unique to 06 that seems more easily explained as the result of translational factors in Latin than transcriptional factors in Greek. Now, the standard text of Greek text of Romans 16:17 begins with perikalo de mas aloki. Now, I implore you, brothers. 06, uniquely in the Greek tradition, replaces perikalo, I implore, with eroto, I ask. Now, in view of what we know about scribal proclivities, this substitution is somewhat surprising. The lemma perikaleo is almost twice as frequent in the New Testament as the lemma erotao. More strikingly, the first person subjunctive exhortation, perikalo, is found 20 times in the New Testament and 15 times in the Pauline Corpus, as opposed to only 9 times in the New Testament and once in the Pauline Corpus, or eroto. Furthermore, a consultation of all 29 instances of these forms in the most comprehensive available apparatuses of the Greek tradition for each occasion shows that there is no other place of lemmatic variation between these two words in either direction. No review of this evidence is presented in tables 5 and 6 with the sources consulted placed in parentheses. In other words, there's no other place in the tradition where a monolingual Greek witness substitutes eroto for perikalo or perikalo for eroto. There's no semantic shifts between these two words in the Greek tradition that we know about, that we're looking at. On the other hand, there is considerable variation in how these words are translated in the Old Latin tradition. Obsecro is the standard translation of perikalo, and rogo is the standard translation of eroto. Yet in no less than 9 of the 20 instances of perikalo, some portion of the Old Latin tradition renders perikalo by rogo, with Romans 16:17 being one of those locations. Furthermore, there's also a location in where a portion of the Old Latin renders eroto by obsecro, standard translation for perikalo. So there's no sort of fuzziness in the transcriptional evidence, but in the translational evidence, including in places where there's no evidence for this reading in Greek, there's considerable shift in the Latin. And when this evidence is taken into account, understandable translational variation within the Old Latin tradition is by far the most probable explanation of the otherwise surprising substitution in 06. In other words, a defensible translation of the standard Greek text, followed by an understandable retroversion of the Latin text, has led to the creation of a Greek reading that had no previous existence and needs no other explanation. While the evidence is not quite as straightforward, this same explanation makes good sense of the even more surprising substitution of ukiamat for udello in 06 and 012 and Romans 1:13. Now, I'd love to work through many more examples, but we have time for just one more. And this one ties together, this is my favorite, because it ties together both of the primary contributions of this paper. Find the data for this in table 7. This is Romans 15:32. While there are some subvariations, the standard Greek text of Romans 15:32 ends with sinanapopsomet me. 06, however, has the surprising substitution of anasikso met imo. 012 has anasiko instead of anasitso, but otherwise it has the same reading of 06, and it likely goes back to their common ancestor. Sinanapopsomet, to rest with, occurs only here in the New Testament, and the standard text of the New Testament, anasiko, to provide relief or to refresh, occurs only in 2 Timothy 1:16. So we're dealing with 2 hapax legomenon in the standard text of the New Testament. Now, in both the Old Latin and the Vulgate traditions, both of these two words are generally translated by some form of the same Latin word, refrigero, to relieve or refresh. Now, that by itself would not necessarily explain this textual change. Okay, the Latin translates these two Greek words with one Latin word. How big a deal is that? Well, there is more. As we established earlier, the textual form that seems to be at the root of the bilingual tradition of Romans is very close to P46 and 03. And as it turns out, P46 and 03 uniquely omit the clause entirely, surely as the result of a scribal error in their common exemplar, or common ancestor, not exemplar, ancestor. If the revisers that produced the common ancestor of 06 and 012 were indeed, as I propose, working from such Greek texts, then their Greek text would have been missing these words. And if they were comparing it to a Latin text rather than a Greek text, we would expect them to add in the missing words as a retroversion from the Latin, exactly as Erasmus did when he found his Greek manuscripts of Revelation to be deficient. He compared them to his Latin manuscript, and he retroverted it and created a new reading in the process, and that is what happened here as well. The shift of the prepositional sense with from seen to met and from the verb to the pronoun, also in agreement with the Latin, is easily explicable by a normal Latin translation of the standard Greek text, followed by an ordinary, or if overly wooden, retroversion of that translation. Taken together, this strengthens the case both for the connection of the bilingual tradition of Romans to P46 and 03, and also for seeing a number of the deviations from that cluster as explicable by translational rather than transcriptional processes. Now, this has not been a full excavation of all the many textual layers found in 06, in particular, the relationship between 06 and the later Byzantine text, and between both of these and the text of Chrysostom's Homilies on Romans, exceedingly complex, and I haven't fully sorted it out yet. But the evidence presented enables us to draw some preliminary conclusions. First, there's a very strong semantic connection between P46, 03, and 06, or 12. Given especially the pattern shown in our second point, by far the most plausible explanation is that the so-called Western text found in 06 or 12 is a heavily corrected descendant of a manuscript in the P46 or 03 cluster. It therefore makes little sense to divide the textual transmission of Romans into Eastern and Western streams. Furthermore, unique agreements of P46, 03, and 06, given this close connection, are almost certain to be secondary. Second, given that there are clear cases where the process of translation and retroversion does a much better job of accounting for the evidence than transcriptional factors alone, we should not assume that readings unique to the bilinguals are necessarily relics of a much earlier period. Translation is inherently more creative than transcription and affords more opportunities for textual change than simply copying a text. Rather than providing evidence for a lost time when every scribe did what was right in his or her own eyes, the unusual readings of the bilingual tradition may simply be the result of a well-intentioned but misguided process of diorthosis and retroversion that ignored translational realities. Doing so, they were by no means unique. After all, as P. Williams has shown, some modern scholars have done exactly the same thing with the Old Syriac. Like Ambrosiaster and the revisers between the Greek text of 05 and 06, Adalbert Merckx was even convinced that his retroversions from the Old Syriac provided better evidence for access to the Greek original than any of the extant Greek manuscripts, exactly as these revisers seem to have thought. Finally, while the Western text remains fascinating, it seems to me more likely to be an interesting eddy in the transformational history of the New Testament than one of the fundamental streams into which it divides. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich paper. Before our lunch break, we have time for a question or two. Yes, Hugh and then Paul.
Well, Jerry's got one in the chat.
Okay, yes. Is it ready or shall we start with Paul? Yeah, okay, Paul.
But I think Romans 15:32 in the Latin is the first evidence for the expression to chill out with someone. But I guess my two serious. I wonder with often models of textual families have been taken over from the Gospels and applied to Paul. So I wonder if the whole model of a Western text is just a hangover. And your argument, I think, actually deconstructs that even further. So I think you could even be bolder in what you're claiming and whether, this is even a helpful label or if
No, I'm precisely arguing that it's not.
No,
I agree completely. I don't think this is a helpful label at all.
The other thing, and this may be controversial in this company, but I notice you haven't posted in your evidence, and I'm guessing I know the reason why, archiensis. And while there's a tendency, I think, to cite 0319 and 320, which are definitely abstract, I just wonder why there's a divide over the relationship. If it's actually just supplying the extra evidence and letting people decide.
Yeah, so the reason is that Alec recently published an article that demonstrates that, and so because of that, it's not in the collation that it was based
Due
on.
respect, that's one opinion. So I think
Okay, let's have an opinion too on the.
But I think there's yeah, but I mean.
Sorry,
Yeah, but the reason is that evidence is not in the
No, sorry,
collation.
we must give Joey a chance
Yes.
too. Okay,
Yeah.
and you can fight with your phone.
Yes.
Chill out, chill out.
Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. So I just want to start by saying it was a great talk. Thank you so much for sharing that. One thing that came to mind as you were talking about this was that in my work on Ephesians, I've noticed that there are several places where the Latin side of the diglots actually agree with P46 and O3, while the Greek side does not. And I wonder, I mean, I think that would be an interesting area of further investigation, but how might those agreements affect your thesis about sort of the source of the diglots?
Yeah, so there's yes, that is okay. That is a very important question. There are two possible explanations. One is this diorthosis, because there are some unique readings in 06 and there are some unique readings in the 012 family, that this actually happens in the shared exemplar that goes back a few centuries earlier. So it could be, and there's clear evidence that the Greek in 06 has a layer of revisions that's moved it farther away from that source text. So it could just be that 06 has revisions there. That would be the simple sort of ordinary explanation.
Okay.
There's also the possibility that, especially given how all the lacuna in P46, it has recently been suggested that P46 may not be as early as we have thought, that actually it could be itself mid-4th century. And if that's the case, because there are these sort of odd readings in P46 for which this process could be an explanation, I haven't looked into this in detail. I certainly do not want anyone to think that I necessarily think this, because it's sort of a wild speculation, but it could be that this is the explanation for the weird readings in P46, and that P46 is itself later and has been influenced by the Latin tradition. I'm not saying I necessarily think that, but that's the other possibility. So either they've been revised away in 06 and they were present in the common ancestor of 06 and 012, or P46 itself, and if we had all of it, we would see this more clearly, perhaps, has some sort of Latin influence. That's something I'd like to look at more in more detail. So,
Thank you very much for that. Before we go to lunch, are there any announcements? No, thank you. Then please join me at the